Hey everyone, welcome to Mind Unboxed, the channel where we unpack the strangest, most unsettling corners of the human brain, psychology, and reality itself. Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing psychiatric conditions ever documented, Capgras Syndrome, also known as the Capgras Delusion, or the Imposter Syndrome of the brain. Imagine looking at your mother, your spouse, your child, someone you've loved your entire life, and being completely, unshakably convinced that the person standing in front of you is not them. They look identical down to the smallest detail. Same face, same voice, same mannerisms. But something deep inside you screams, this is a fake, an imposter, a duplicate, maybe even a robot or an alien wearing their skin. You don't feel the warmth, the emotional connection, the automatic sense of familiarity that should flood your heart when you see a loved one. Instead, there's cold detachment, and that absence of feeling convinces your brain that the real person has been replaced. This isn't paranoia in the usual sense. People with Capgras syndrome aren't afraid of being persecuted by strangers. They're terrified, or sometimes curiously calm, about the fact that the people closest to them have been swapped out for perfect copies. Some patients demand proof of identity. Others call the police to report kidnapping. A few even become aggressive toward the imposter, believing they're protecting the real loved one from harm. Capgras syndrome was first described in 1923 by French psychiatrists Joseph Capgras and Jean Reboul-Lachaud. They reported the case of a 53-year-old woman who believed her husband, daughter, and many others had been replaced by doubles. She claimed there were thousands of these imposters walking around, and that the police were refusing to investigate the mass substitution. She became known in the literature as Madame M, one of the earliest documented cases. But how can the brain produce such a specific, bizarre, and yet logically structured delusion? To understand, we need to look at how normal face recognition works. When you see a familiar face, two separate pathways in your brain light up almost simultaneously. First, the visual pathway. The fusiform face area in the temporal lobe instantly recognizes the unique configuration of features and identifies the person. That's my wife. Second, the emotional pathway. Connections to the amygdala and limbic system generate an automatic warm feeling of familiarity, affection, and trust. The gut sense that says, yes, this is really her, and I love her. In Capgras syndrome, the first pathway, the visual recognition, remains completely intact. That's why the person looks absolutely identical. But the second pathway, the emotional connection, is damaged or disconnected, often due to brain injury, stroke, dementia, schizophrenia, or other neurological conditions. The brain receives perfect visual confirmation, but zero emotional confirmation. Faced with this mismatch, it does what brains do best. It constructs an explanation. And the explanation it lands on is terrifyingly logical within its own broken framework. The face is right, but the feeling is gone. Therefore, this cannot be the real person. They must have been replaced. Neurologists V.S. Ramachandran and William Herstein proposed one of the most influential theories in the 1990s. They studied patients with Capgras and used skin conductance tests, a measure of emotional arousal. When healthy people see photos of loved ones, their skin conductance spikes dramatically. In Capgras patients, it barely moves, even for the closest family members. But when shown pictures of strangers, their response is normal. The emotional wiring to familiar faces is severed, yet the cognitive recognition remains. Ramachandran called this the loss of emotional gating, and it reveals something profound about human relationships. Love isn't just intellectual knowledge. It's a visceral, automatic feeling wired deep in the limbic system. Remove that feeling, and even perfect resemblance isn't enough to convince the brain of authenticity. Real cases are heartbreaking. One man insisted his wife had been replaced by an impostor and refused to sleep in the same bed as the fake. He would speak politely to her during the day, but secretly planned to find his real wife. Another patient believed her cat had been swapped and refused to feed the duplicate animal. In some tragic cases involving dementia, elderly patients have attacked the impostor spouse, believing they were defending the original. Capgras can appear suddenly after head trauma. One famous case involved a young man who, after a car accident, woke up convinced his parents were actors hired to impersonate them. He recognized their faces perfectly but felt nothing, and spent months searching for his real family. The syndrome sometimes extends beyond people. Patients have claimed their house, their dog, even themselves in the mirror have been replaced. When it affects self-recognition, it overlaps with another delusion called the mirrored self misidentification. Treatment is difficult because patients have no insight. They're absolutely certain their belief is true. Antipsychotic medications can help if the syndrome is part of schizophrenia or psychosis. In cases linked to brain injury or dementia, managing the underlying condition is the main approach. Family members often learn to cope by not arguing the delusion directly, and instead focusing on building new emotional connections over time. Capgras syndrome is extremely rare, estimated to affect less than 1% of people with psychiatric or neurological conditions. But its existence forces us to confront a disturbing truth. Our sense of who people are isn't based purely on how they look or what they say. It's rooted in an invisible emotional signal that we usually take completely for granted. Remove that signal, and the entire foundation of trust and love collapses, even when everything else appears perfectly normal. It's a reminder of how fragile our grip on reality really is. One small disconnection in the vast wiring of the brain, and the people we love most can become strangers wearing their faces. That's Capgras Syndrome, the delusion that turns affection into alienation in the blink of a neurological misfire. If this story gave you chills or made you think twice about how we really know our loved ones, let me know in the comments. Have you ever heard of anything this eerie before? If you want more deep dives into the strangest corners of the human mind, smash that like button, subscribe to Mind Unboxed, and hit the bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and give your loved ones an extra hug tonight, just to feel that emotional connection is still there. See you in the next one.